Hello and welcome to Stand in the Gap. I'm Sam Rohrer, and I'm going to be joined in just a moment by Stand in the Gap co-host Pastor Isaac Crockett. Can I ask you a question? Do you love freedom? Are you thankful to live in America? Are you increasingly concerned, though, that there are many Americans who are embracing socialism, liberalism, Marxism, or Islam as political and ideological systems equal to or superior to the American holy experiment in self-government under God, as William Penn from Pennsylvania described it back in 1692? But can you define and defend what our founders described as our rights coming from God? Do you define the terms of life, liberty, or the pursuit of happiness? Now, in reality, the foundations of liberty in America have long been undermined by the termites of anti-God worldviews and become a far greater threat to freedom as we've known it than any coronavirus or economic weakness that may be affecting us. It's my belief that most Americans, though, don't know the real connection between God and life, or God and liberty. And because they can't define these terms or explain their connection to God, they're impotent to defend what they mean. So today, I want to go behind the headlines and look foundationally at the connection between God and a Judeo-Christian worldview and the concept of freedom, and then contrast that to the pursuit of socialism by so many in our culture today. Our theme for both Part 1 and Part 2 next week will be this: no God, no freedom. Say no to God, embrace socialism. On today's program, we're going to make the connection between God as creator and why the linkage is necessary for civil freedom, and we'll examine the reality of why knowing God is to know life and liberty. Next week, we'll focus on the connection between knowing God and understanding the essential right of private property referred to by some founders as the pursuit of happiness. You'll recognize, of course, the opening to the Declaration of Independence here when I read this. It starts like this: when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with one another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, then it goes on and says these words: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And to walk with Isaac and me through this focus will be special guest Dr. Max Lyons. He's a teacher, author, researcher, and speaker. He has a master's degree in Christian school education administration from Regent University and his PhD in Christian education from Whitefield Theological Seminary. Dr. Lyons is currently serving as Director of Teaching Services at the Foundation for American Christian Education. And with that, I want to welcome to the program right now Dr. Max Lyons. Max, thank you for being with us today.
Great to be here, Sam. Thank you for having me.
Max, we got a great topic to go over, and it can go a lot longer than we have time, so I'm going to jump right into it here with you. I read from the Declaration of Independence, and they started out talking about natural law, nature's law, and nature's God. Why did they start with that? And perhaps just define here for us, what does it mean by natural law?
Well, briefly, they started with the phrase laws of nature and nature's God, because that was referring to the laws of nature was the law of God that's inherent. Before God gave his law to Moses, man understood inherently, because God put this in them, that, for example, we don't lie, we don't murder, we don't steal. This is natural law. This is before God gave his law in his word. And the laws of nature's God is the law that God gave to us in the Bible, in his word. That is the revealed law. And of course, they started with that because they were biblically thinking people. So they started with God, and it's common in biblical covenants to start with the sovereign who initiates the covenant. So it's very appropriate for them as biblically thinking men to start with God. God's the starting place in His law.
That's interesting because that's exactly what the Pilgrims did in the Mayflower Compact as well. When they started out, actually it was to they started recognizing God immediately. Correct? Yes,
and then they started the document usually the way we would think someone would end a document. They said, "In the name of God, Amen." So as biblically thinking people, making a governmental document, the Mayflower Compact, one of our most important governmental documents, establishing Christian self-government. They started the starting place for them, and that is God.
And ladies and gentlemen, we'll continue the discussion in just a moment with Dr. Max Lyons. We're talking today about knowing God is to know freedom, and we're going to look at how this ties into the concepts of life and liberty. And then in the next program, we'll talk about how it ties into that matter of pursuit of happiness. Stay with us. We'll be right back in just a moment to continue this focus.
Truth, flexible or permanent? The Bible, ancient history, or powerfully relevant? Culture, a reflection of enlightenment or warning signs? The pastor, commentator, or frontline combatant? Every day, American Pastors Network speaks to these questions where and when they matter. With hundreds of affiliate radio stations nationwide, a website and mobile app screening today's headlines through the twin lenses of the Bible and the Constitution, educating, informing, equipping. This is the American Pastors Network. The time is now to stand in the gap for truth.
Max, let's continue the discussion here. In the last segment, I asked you to define natural law, and you basically described natural law is really moral law that pre-existed the Ten Commandments, God's moral law. So it was always wrong to kill. It was always wrong to steal, and people knew it, but then Moses took and codified it in the Ten Commandments. And that, I'm holding in my hand right now, God's law. You referred to it as revealed law. Could you connect now, if you could, natural law, or the law of nature, and revealed law, what I was holding in my hand, and how these two worked together and must work together, and how our founders worked them together as they then later took and laid out and defined life, liberty, which we'll get into in just a moment.
Well, again, you think, what law was it that judged with the Cain and Abel situation, right, where there was murder? That preceded Moses' law by a long period of time, and we have nations today that don't have the Word of God. They don't have the revealed law of God or the written Word, and yet those people, God is going to hold them accountable to the law that's, as the Scripture says, the unwritten law, the law that's written upon our heart. But that was not enough, so God gave us His written Word, His revealed Word, and His law that is for our blessing and for our good. You read Psalm 119, the longest of the Psalms. Every one of the verses in there talk about God's law in some aspect and how beautiful it is, how wonderful it is, how it's for our good and for our benefit. And our founders knew this. They were students of the Word, and they realized that either we're going to live life and we're going to have a government based upon the revealed law of God, or it's going to have to be upon the ideas of man. And they were students of history. They knew that has never worked and will not work.
Well, Max, you're right. It won't work without God. And so we want to look at why it's so important that we have to believe not just in a sovereign, but not just in a God, but in the God, the creator of the world. That's part of the biblical worldview, and how that connects with these issues of life and liberty. But even before that, going back to the Declaration of Independence that we're talking about, We're talking, it starts with life, and then liberty that, goes from there. Why is it important that it starts with life? And then kind of a follow-up to that, why is it important that that has to be connected to the Creator God, the biblical, God of Christianity, Judeo-Christian worldview?
Right. Well, I do think the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, or property, as was commonly understood before that, I do think that they are in order, although in a sense they are one right. And of course, our founder said that these are not the only rights, but certainly the most important is life, because God is the one who's the giver of life. Every human being, every life is precious in the eyes of God. And this, of course, relates, we could relate it very quickly to the whole issue of abortion and the fact that some of God's creation are not even allowed to enjoy the first right, the right to life. And if you think about it, all the other rights, liberty, pursuit of happiness, freedom of speech, right to self-defense, that all depends upon the first right, the right to life. If you don't have that, you can certainly not enjoy any other of the rights that God has ordained for you.
Well, so Max, it's super interesting that you would say it like that, because the next part is liberty. And we live in a day and age where people say, you're infringing upon my liberty by imposing your, archaic point of view about pro-life or whatever. I have the right to make my own choices, especially, we're talking with, women who want to have an abortion, or, family members, different ones who want to, encourage them to do that. That's not your choice. This is their right. This is their liberty to do this. So we go life and then liberty. Can you define for us what they meant by liberty? Because what we're seeing as liberty today is infringing upon another person's life. So what did they mean by life and then liberty? And then again, connect that liberty again in a biblical sense, connected to God.
Well, you bring out a good point, and that is we are defining terms, very important terms, very differently today. And of course, we define things according to our worldview. And if you have a biblical worldview, you'll define liberty as God defines it. And that is that we have freedoms, many, many freedoms that He's given us to live our life, to seek Him, to obey Him, and then to live our life as we see fit under Him. That is true liberty. The libertarians actually got that part pretty good. There are often some other areas, but their idea of liberty, that we can live our life free from most governmental interference, is a biblical view of liberty. And of course, the world defines liberty as what? I can do whatever or almost whatever I want. And certainly in the taking of an unborn life, that's not your liberty, because we don't have the liberty to take another person's life.
So you're talking about a big difference, because it all comes back to our context, to our worldview, biblical worldview versus human or socialist or progressive worldview. And so liberty is a part of God-given freedoms, how God created us and how God intended the world to be, versus a twisted version that says, I get what I want, I'm always first, I'm always right. So let's take that a little further. Let's go into this idea of biblical worldview, Judeo-Christian worldview, and talk about the atmosphere, the environment that you create with that. Is it possible to have true freedom? Is it possible to have freedom that encourages life and liberty? A world or a community, a culture, a nation, I think would be maybe the best word. Can you have a nation? Can you have a governing organization that allows for fruitful, abundant life and real liberty, true freedom as God intended it to be, if they don't see God in it all? If they don't have a biblical worldview, can they truly have the kind of freedom that our founders envisioned for our nation? Well,
I think you kind of answered your own question. The answer is no, that true freedom comes in Christ. And, there's the internal liberty. I like to say, free from sin, that's the internal liberty. And then free from the tyranny of men, that's the external liberty that God has called us to enjoy. But if we're not free internally, if we're not free from sin, we can't be free externally. And man, as much as he wants that, he wants to throw off, as in Psalm 2 it says, just cast their cords away from us, cast off the restraints of God and Christianity and religion. It's bondage. And the history of the world has shown this to be true. So no, we cannot enjoy true liberty as God ordains for us without obedience to him.
And I like that too, that you point out. I mean, you can't deny, if you look through a history book, you can watch the rise and falls of different nations and governments and dictators, and you can look and you can see their worldview, and you can see what life was like under them. You can see these regimes and how toxic they often are to the most vulnerable, to babies, to children, to women, to people who maybe are different or look different or have something different about them than the rest of the majority population. And so even just looking through that contextually through history is really helpful. Sam, you and I were talking before the program about freedom, and it's so interesting. It just makes me so grateful, obviously, for the sovereignty of God and for his blessings that all of us have. But in our nation, that God in his sovereignty gave such biblical wisdom to these founding fathers as we look at them. And you were saying that freedom is not accidental. We didn't just accidentally get, oh, well, look at this, America has all this freedom, how did that happen? But at the same time, if you go back and you look at, Cold War, I know my dad was in the Soviet Union, and I've been in churches that were underground churches during those times. And in socialism and communism and dictatorships, those don't happen just accidentally either. There are incremental steps. There's planning that goes on. Could you maybe comment on that as we look at this context of biblical worldview?
Well, absolutely, Isaac. And that's part of the practical application of this we're talking about with Max today. But in reality, one's view of God is a choice. And as Max was saying earlier, I think back to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 30, where God took the people of Israel into the land, and he told them, now I'm going to give you this great abundance. Here's this fruitful land, lots of water, the weather's good, the ground is fertile. And he said, and I'm going to give you good things, but it's going to be dependent upon you choosing to follow, as we've talked about, the revealed law. Follow what I say, and he says it will be equivalent to choosing life.
Yeah.
But if you don't do these things, it will be equivalent to choosing death. So the whole point, our founders, as Max was saying, as we've talked about before, our founders purposely walked through these principles. It was not an accident that they put down, we're endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. It's not an accident they cited natural law. It's not an accident they talked about nature, God. That was a purposeful decision that they did because they chose early on. Do we want to be blessed and have a nation that's free? Yes. Where do we find out about that? God's Word. Did they go back to Deuteronomy and cite those passages? They did. They talked about them. So in our life today, whether or not we continue to have freedom or whether or not we choose to embrace socialism as a nation is not going to be accidental. It's going to be a choice of our people, and that's why hopefully in what we're talking about today will help people understand we're not here by accident, neither will we keep freedom by accident.
Yeah, that's so interesting, Sam. And I remember a time when I was talking with some pastors and had been underground church in Eastern Europe, had been under communism, and they had recently gotten freedom. And I remember one man who was involved with one of the pastors saying, I'm reading this book and it says why democracy works in the West or in America and it fails everywhere else. But these things, having true abundant life, having true liberty and freedom, they do work when we put ourselves under God's plan, because that was God's plan for us all along. God's plan was for us to be able to glorify Him and enjoy the life that He gives us. And as we get away from Him and as we get away from His plan, that's when things start to crumble, the foundations even of our culture and of our nation. So we want to talk about this more and look at this connection between the truth of having life and liberty as what God designed for us. That's part of His design, and how it draws us back to Him in a biblical worldview. We're going to take a brief time out and we'll be right back to finish up.
Stand in the Gap is produced and recorded in the studios of WBPH Philadelphia, positively different television.
We're going to conclude the program right now, and I want to bring back in Max Lyons in this discussion. Max, I want you to take and summarize now what we've talked about. We started with God as creator, which is biblical worldview. You've explained natural law, nature's God, revealed law being the Bible. Our founders took it, purposely chose it, put it into Declaration of Independence, which started our nation, and referenced God as creator, unalienable rights, then life and liberty. And we've compared that a little bit to the fact that it's a choice. But now we're in a circumstance in our nation, never here before really, where we have so many people, the numbers are big, that are saying they think that socialism, Marxism, is equal to or maybe superior to a representative government before under God as our founders gave us. Why, Max, and this is the question, why is the understanding of God as creator, the giver of these rights of life and liberty, perhaps our best deterrent against the inroads of socialism and Marxism and these other isms that are really the termites undermining our foundation of liberty?
Well, I wish I had an hour on this one, but I'll give you the Cliff Notes version. That is Christianity, both Christianity and Marxism. I'm just going to use Marxism as a substitute for socialism, communism. All the isms basically boil down to the same thing. There are nuances of understanding, but these are both worldviews. They are comprehensive worldviews. Marxism is not just an economic system, so we need to look at them. We need to look at in Christian terms or religious terms, we need to look at them as rival religions. And so, the God of Christianity obviously is the God of the Bible. The God of Marxism, communism, socialism is what? It's ultimately man, because it's based upon atheism. And so it's obvious. Eventually, you're going to end up with, under that system, when it comes into its full fruit, under the tyranny of a sinful man and under the tyranny of an all-powerful state. Because all religions, all worldviews, there's a sovereign. So you want a sovereign God, sovereign, loving God, the God of the Bible, or do you want a sovereign, totalitarian state? And look at the history of the world for the last 100 years. If you don't know that history, go and learn it. It's easily accessible, and it's ugly, it's horrendous, it's evil, and we're fooling ourselves. People today think socialism is free stuff, and because of our sinful nature, a lot of people are saying, give me the free stuff, but be careful for what you wish for, because we're wishing for something that is horrific. And I'm glad for the people that are sounding the alarms, and you all are sounding the alarm, and I am as well. We need to all be doing that.
Max, great summary, and I think you put it right before us. Thank you so much. And next week, ladies and gentlemen, come back. We're going to continue with Max. We'll take this discussion and we'll go into the area of life, liberty, and then pursuit of happiness, which is private property. And you'll be amazed at the power of the concept of private property and how it all fits together. We'll go there. But as you've heard, whether or not we choose to follow the God of heaven or we choose to follow man as God is a choice. We beg you, choose God. The Bible tells us all about it. Our founders did as well, and we are the beneficiaries of what they gave us, but we can also lose everything if we continue to turn our back on God. Well, thank you for watching us today, and I'd encourage you, go to our website, standinthegapmedia.org. Communicate with us. Let us know that you are watching this program, what it means to you. And it's been so good this last week to hear from pastors and from others across the country who are telling us that they are benefiting, you are benefiting so significantly by this program. We need your prayer support. We need your financial support. We need your partnering to help this ministry of truth on practical issues affecting our daily lives to go forward across America. God bless you all. Stand in the gap for truth where God has you this week.